So, welcome to part two of Uncanny Returns documentary and animation in the new Documentary Ecology. This is, of course, the second part of week 12 for VISM 4003 Contemporary Documentary Media. In this second part of the lecture, I will just be discussing animation, collaboration, and the visualization of mental life in the animated documentary, and then turn to our questions and discussion topics. So, animation, collaboration, and the visualization of mental life. I just want to turn to something I brought up in the um, first half of this lecture, which was a quote from Honus Rowe, the reading The Evolution of Animated Documentary, in which she writes, quote, that if we relinquish the post-direct cinema assumption that documentary equals unobtrusive filming, there is no reason animation is not as valid a representational strategy for documentary as other techniques used in theatrically released documentaries. Right? So if we can get past thinking about documentaries as simply only rooted in indexical inscriptions of reality, right, of capturing, bodies and things in the world with light bouncing off of them through a camera lens. If we can, and then that all of that related to the idea of an unobtrusive camera capturing, in a kind of cinema verite observational style, the world as it unfolds, as it were, without the intervention of the filmmaker, the presence of the filmmaker, the so-called fly on the wall. If we can get past that, which we've seen that contemporary documentary in many ways has, with its use of these other representational strategies that Honus Rowe mentions, including things like, for example, reenactment, using appropriated images to produce what Jamie Barron calls the archive effect, which of course use indexical images, right? Inscribed images from the world, but also repurposes them, uses images from advertisements and even fiction films and repurposes them inside of documentaries to make claims about the world, but also, as I said, reenactments, um, among other things. And also, of course, experimentation with video, the graininess of video, translation, as we saw in My Language, etc. We have all of these different techniques and stylistic and aesthetic strategies that have been deployed in contemporary documentary. And so we're saying, in a sense, following Rowe, well, animation, which has a long history with the documentary, is also perhaps really important to consider, especially when we're thinking about the visualization of people's interior psychological and emotional lives. So I just wanted to go through quickly go through a few examples of animated documentaries that use animation to help us understand, um, you know, um, different mental states, different subjective and psychological experiences. And a number of these are particularly autistic people, and their experiences, which we could also think about in relationship to one of the videos I asked you to watch last week, which was, of course, In My Language by Mel Beggs. So we're again taking up this theme of autism and documentary representation. One of the important films in this light of animated documentary and autism is, of course, Tim Webb's 1992 A is for Autism. And Honus Rowe argues that this film was observes that this film was a collaboration with various autistic participants, particularly children, that was aimed to give insight to this, what was conceived as a brain disorder. And we could, of course, challenge that and dispute that, and many of these films do. In various ways. She goes on that A is for Autism, one of the first films in the 1990s wave of animated documentaries, was significant in setting the precedent for collaborative working. It includes creative contributions in the form of drawings, animation, and music performances from people with autism, and the film is subtitled A Collaboration. So animation is also important here, not only for taking us into, as it were, the interior life of people, in particular autistic people, and their rich interior lives, but it also is a method of working that allows for neurodivergent people, like autistic people, to participate and collaborate in the construction of the documentary film. So it is also a kind of social practice. So it's an aesthetic, but it also yields social effects as well, animation. We also, of course, have the example of Bob Sabiston's 1999 documentary short Snack and Drink, in which he deployed a software program, animation program that he developed entitled Rotoshop, which I'll return to in a moment, um, which effectively involved tracing over live action video or representational images of people and then turning them effectively into animated representations or even perhaps cartoons. So Honus Rowe observes that this film is really about the encounter between Ryan, an autistic teenage boy, and the film's director, Bob Sabiston. And then, of course, she points out that several of Sabiston's digitally rotoscoped animated interviews, using what I described, what I noted was his software Rotoshop, are viewable on YouTube and Vimeo. And Vimeo even has a channel, as she said. So this is part of that question of documentary ecology, right? So this film, Snack and Drink, is really short. It's about 3 minutes, and it really is a collaboration between Sabiston, his proprietary software Rotoshop, and then the family members of Ryan. He invited them to view the footage that he shot, the actual interview they shot with a video camera of the boy, exiting his house, walking down the street, going to a corner store, pouring himself a drink, a big gulp, I think at a 7-Eleven, buying some nerds, and then heading home. And this then is put into Rotoshop, and members of Ryan's family also got to then draw over the images, right, and effectively produce their own animated interpretations of Ryan and his experience of the world. Now, very quickly, what is Rotoshop? Well, Rotoshop is a sort of digital software that draws on the well-established technique of rotoscope, which goes back to at least the 1920s in animation that was used by people like the Flesher brothers. And here we have a drawing here illustrating the technique of the rotoscope by Max Flesher from the late 1920s, early 1930s. Disney, of course, used rotoscope type techniques as well in films like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, for example, to produce realistic movement of the body, right? As I said, it traces of reality and movement. So again, live action photography would be shot, and then it would be projected back out, and then the animator or the artist would trace over this projected image, right? Individual frames of the body of the subject, and then those would be rephotographed and then brought together in sort of traditional animation style, and then would produce movement, and it would produce highly realistic movement, particularly of human bodies, because it would be rooted in photographic, cinematographic indexicality, right? But as we see with the instance of Ryan, it can also be used to produce exaggerations and other modalities of transformation that are nevertheless rooted in a kind of indexical inscription, right? Video and then tracing, right? But nevertheless can also involve higher degrees of mediation and interpretation therein. So this is part of the sort of complex collaboration that animated documentary, in this case through the software of Rotoshop, can produce. We also, of course, have another example that Honus Rowe brings up is the Animated Minds series by Andy Glynn. Honus Rowe writes that animated documentaries aimed at raising awareness around social issues, of which there are many, usually have a dedicated website where viewers can watch the films for free. Animated Minds, 2003 as well as 2009, is a pioneering pair of series in this area. The first was supported by the UK broadcaster Channel 4 as part of a series on mental health, and the second, initially called Troubled Minds, was funded by cable channel Teachers TV, and health charity The Wellcome Trust, and focuses on mental health issues in youngsters. All three 8-minute films are viewable on the series' own site at animatedminds.com, which I encourage you to check out. On that site, you'll find a film like Andy Glynn's The Light Bulb Thing, which is described as, quote, a woman's story about becoming more manic as she soars to the heights of euphoria, literally floating through the air on the winds of grandiosity and disinhibition. And then, without warning, we see the fall to despair, to a dark world without meaning, an inner world of depression made all the worse by the still fresh memory of the essence of her euphoria, the light bulb within her. So we have here, in the case of The Light Bulb Thing, a voiceover that was recorded of this subject, this real person, this woman, and her mania, describing her mania, and then we have this kind of impressionistic and expressionistic animation that accompanies it to help us to illuminate and represent her experience of her mania circulating around this light bulb. Then in 2004, another example we could think of in terms of animating interior mental states and the complex processes that make that up, we have Chris Landreth's Academy Award-winning short film, Ryan, which was released in 2004 and was produced with the National Film Board of Canada. Inside of that film, when we can think about collaboration, one of the very obvious instances of collaboration is, of course, the film is rooted around an interview between Chris Landreth, the animator, and then, of course, the subject Ryan Larkin, who was also an animator and an award-winning animator who made some famous films in the 1960s through the NFB, such as Walking in 1968, which we see an instance of in Chris Landreth's Ryan. And then we also see instances of one of his last films as well, with these sort of biomorphic shapes of hands, arms, and legs emerging from geometric and organic forms. And so we have, in sort of a sense of collaboration, we have both the interview, which the film is structured around, and then, of course, we have his own animation, Ryan Larkin's own animation, coming to inform in some ways, some of the stylistic properties of Chris Landreth's film. Now, of course, we also have a sense of reenactment in Ryan. As Jeffrey Scholar, in his essay Making It Unreal, drawing on Bill Nichols, has written, quote, "In Ryan, when the live-action documentary footage returns, the interview footage, psychedelically animated, it destabilizes," this is him drawing, quoting Nichols, "it destabilizes the documentary's conventional discourse of sobriety to push it in the direction of the film's mirroring discourse of delirium. Such reenactments belong to a situated phantasmatic that nullifies the status of that other phantasmatic of objectivity, omniscience, and finality that haunts the documentary film and its kindred discourses of sobriety." So what we're really seeing here is this sense of reenactment inside of Ryan. The use of animation inside of these reenactments sort of heightens this sense of the phantasmatic, the fantasy structures that are operating, the subjectivities that are operating in these social actors documented in a documentary film. It brings even further attention to this, right? We see here on the left in this sort of reenactment of Ryan Larkin, animated by Chris Landreth, of his sort of fragmentation, right? His face becoming, sort of warping away, mutating, transforming, and also fragmenting and collapsing in on itself. And this is part of the film's sort of stylistic grammar that's taking us through these reenactments and through animation into this sort of psychedelic and destabilized experience of Ryan Larkin's traumatic mental life. And so finally, we can look at also another example, which is the film An Eyeful of Sound, which was released in 2011 and made by Samantha Moore. Honus Rowe observes of the film that it, quote, "aims to convey the subjective experience of synesthesia, a neurological condition that causes people to experience senses simultaneously. In the case of the collaborators of An Eyeful of Sound, audiovisual synesthesia, where sounds prompt a sensory reaction such as taste or color perception." So the film is trying to, through this audiovisual medium, among other things, it is trying to capture this particular experience of synesthesia that conjoins together sound, taste, touch, scent, what have you, all together. And it's trying to achieve this through the use of animation in the documentary form. Now, on the level of collaboration, of course, Honus Rowe points out that An Eyeful of Sound is described by the filmmaker Samantha Moore herself as produced as a collaboration between, quote, "a group of people with synesthesia and neuropsychologist Dr. Jamie Ward at the University of Sussex." So the film is highly collaborative in this way because, and this is Honus Rowe, as Moore points out, the subjective perceptual nature of synesthesia means that there is no pro-filmic event to compare the veracity of the interpreted outcome with She instead chose to check the accuracy of her visualization through a back and forth process with her synesthetic collaborators. Now, of course, veracity means the relative adequation, perhaps truth, perhaps we could say, of the interpreted outcome, the sort of basis, the rootedness, um, the adequation between what the ultimately what the animation that was produced and how the particular subjects themselves experienced it. It was done through this system of dialogues, right, between the filmmaker and the subjects to arrive finally at the finished form. And then finally, Honus-Rowe says that this process, this dialogue, involved an initial consultation using color charts and asking the collaborators to create drawings and paintings, as well as making audio recordings of their reactions when they listened to sounds that would ultimately be used on the film's soundtrack. Moore then made digital still images that were approved by the synesthetic collaborators before being turned into moving images. So this film has passed through this kind of complex ecological process of where all these different factors, right, all these different participants kind of came together in this negotiation to produce this kind of finished form, right, of the film animated. Um, um, the An Eye Full of Sound, right, to produce this film, The Eye Full of Sound. Okay, so let's then now turn to our question and discussion, and I provided four for us to think about. The first is to consider the entangled histories of animation in the documentary. How does a film like The Sinking of the Lusitania, produced by Winsor McCay in 1918, speak of and to the real social and historical world? In what sense can The Sinking of the Lusitania be considered a documentary, and in what ways can it be said to be a realistic depiction of the event of the sinking of the ship? Second, according to Annabelle Honus-Rowe, animated documentaries respond to and themselves produce both an absence and an excess in the ways that they depict experiences and events that could not have been or cannot be otherwise represented. In light of this simultaneous absence and excess, how do animated documentaries expand our sense of both the aesthetic, that is to say formal, stylistic, and so forth, properties, and epistemological claims of the documentary? So how do this question of absence and excess, how is it at once an aesthetic question and also an epistemological question, a question of knowledge? Third, animated documentaries like A is for Autism, Snack and Drink, The Light Bulb Thing, Ryan, and An Eye Full of Sound use animation to depict interior mental processes and subjective experiences. But that said, how can we consider these animated documentaries to be nevertheless representing the world as opposed to a world, right? Describe some of the ways these documentaries say something about our shared world as opposed to a world, as Annabelle Honus-Rowe puts it, quote, wholly imagined by its creator. How do they escape becoming simply something wholly imagined by the creator and become these collaborative processes? And finally, in The Evolution of Animated Documentary, Honus-Rowe argues that the rise in popularity of the animated documentary, or the use of animation in nonfiction, quote, could be thought of as a reaction to the apparent fakery of reality TV and docu-soaps. Choosing a means of visual representation that is overtly constructed might be potentially appealing to an audience increasingly attuned to the fakery of the apparent real, unquote. So then discuss Rowe's argument regarding the overt constructedness of animation as a response, perhaps, to the simulated, manipulated, or contrived realities of contemporary reality TV, right? So if animated documentary really consolidated itself, started to emerge, really become a popular form in the 1990s and especially in the 2000s and then to the present day, this is also the same period in which reality TV also became a popular phenomenon. And she's asking and inquiring into how perhaps animation in the documentary can also be a kind of questioning of some of the assumptions of reality TV and some of the ways its own excesses and absences need to be further further questioned, right? And then I would like to go on and just have you ask in that about in what ways can the deliberate artifice of animation, broadly put, be considered different from the illusionistic aesthetic of documentary observation put into the service of simulating reality, such as we see in reality television, the types of reality game shows, for example, that we see, reality TV game shows. So I look forward to discussing these four question topics with you this week, and you can also post your thoughts on Canvas. Thank you.